Okay, let's dive into something that's been making headlines. Tariffs.
Yeah,
Everyone seems to have a strong opinion on them.
right.
But, what do American voters really think about all this?
Yeah.
Well, we've got some interesting data from JL Partners. It was commissioned by dailymail.com, and it looks into exactly this.
Cool.
And I got to tell you, the findings are a lot more complicated than a simple for or against.
It's pretty interesting, right? You'd think that um, if folks believed most countries were playing fair in trade, they wouldn't be so gung-ho about tariffs.
Right.
But this data, it suggests something else is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like saying, hey, Canada, we totally think you're being fair, but just in case, we're still going to hit you with this tariff. Like, what's the deal with that?
Yeah, like take Canada. Okay, 53% of American voters believe Canada's been fair in trade.
Okay.
Sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah, sounds positive.
But then you see 34% still want to put tariffs on them.
So it's more than just about being fair then, right? I mean, what else could be behind this support for tariffs?
It's probably a bunch of things. Like some voters might be feeling that economic anxiety, worried about jobs moving overseas.
Right.
Others, maybe they see tariffs as a way to kind of force better deals, even with countries they generally see as being fair. Like it's leverage,
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point. It's like a we'll trust but verify approach to global trade.
Exactly, exactly. And then you can't forget about certain industries. They have their own interests.
Yeah.
Some sectors might be feeling the heat from, foreign competition. So they're pushing for these protections.
Right.
And it's regardless of how fair things seem overall.
Yeah, like if one particular industry is struggling, they might push for tariffs, even if it ends up hurting the average consumer down the line.
Yeah.
It's all about protecting their own turf.
And here's where things get really interesting. This poll shows a massive difference in how Americans see China compared to other countries. Only 20% of voters think China's been fair in trade.
Wow, that's a big gap. It's almost like everybody agrees China's the exception here.
Yeah, definitely reflects the whole trade tension thing.
Right.
And, that long history between the two countries, it's complicated.
Right.
You can't just ignore all that when you're looking at these numbers.
And to make it even more complex, this poll shows a real split between parties.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about Canada and Mexico, Republicans are way more likely to support tariffs against them.
Absolutely. The data is clear on that. Only 35% of Republicans have a good view of Mexico on trade. Compare that to 61% of Democrats.
This whole politicizing of trade, it's a trend we're seeing everywhere in politics these days, and it just throws more fuel on the fire.
For sure. It definitely makes things way more complicated. But, here, we're all about staying neutral, just laying out the facts and letting you, the listener, make your own call. Exactly.
So we've talked about how complex tariffs are, all those moving parts, but let's get real for a second. What happens when these threats about tariffs actually happen? What are the consequences in the real world?
Okay, so think of it this way. The U.S. slaps a 25% tariff on cars coming in from Mexico. What happens? Those cars, for us, for American buyers, they get a lot more expensive.
Right.
And then dealerships, they're going to have trouble selling these pricier cars. Could mean job losses in the whole auto industry, right?
Yeah.
And of course, consumers, every time they want to buy a new car, they're feeling it in their wallets.
Yeah, so it's not just about protecting those American car companies. It's like the whole system around those cars gets hit.
Yeah.
Dealerships, the parts people, everyone who buys those cars,
Yeah.
everyone's affected.
Absolutely. And it's bigger than just that one industry.
Yeah.
Other countries, they're not just going to sit there and take it. They might hit back with their own tariffs on stuff we sell. And that's how these trade wars get started.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those threats from Mexico and Canada? Classic example of how things can blow up fast.
So it's like a game of chicken with everyone's economies. One side pushes, the other pushes back, and things get out of control really quick.
It can be a dangerous game.
Yeah.
And even if, let's just say, other countries don't retaliate, there's no guarantee that American companies can just jump in and fill the gap.
Right.
To build up our own manufacturing here, that takes time. It takes investment. It takes a lot of resources. Companies might not be able to make enough stuff fast enough to meet that sudden demand.
So even if the whole goal is to help American manufacturing, tariffs could actually backfire and hurt the people buying stuff in the process. It's like, I don't know, trying to fix a leaky faucet by smashing the whole sink.
That's one way to put it. You get the idea, though. And prices. We can't forget about prices.
Yeah.
Even if American companies can make more, they might still jack up prices.
Right.
Less competition from those foreign goods that now cost more. So we could end up paying more for everything no matter where it's made.
Okay, so Tariffs can start trade wars, hurt consumers, and maybe not even do what they're supposed to do. But there must be some historical examples that really prove this point, right? Give us the history lesson.
Oh, yeah, history's full of warnings about tariffs.
Hmm.
One of the most famous dating act is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in 1930.
Okay.
This thing, it raised tariffs on something like 20,000 imported goods.
20,000? That's a lot of tariffs. What were they thinking?
The idea was to protect American businesses during the Great Depression,
Okay.
but it totally backfired, big time. Other countries slapped back with their own tariffs, and the whole global economy just tanked even further. A lot of economists believe Smoot-Hawley actually made the Depression worse.
Yikes. Okay, so not a good model to follow. But I'm guessing there are more recent examples too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Things got pretty heated between the U.S. and China during the Trump years. Remember all those tariffs going back and forth?
Oh, well, yeah.
Steel, soybeans, all sorts of stuff. Each side kept upping the ante. Businesses and consumers on both sides, they felt the pain.
Yeah, it felt like every week there was a new headline about tariffs on something else. Hard to even keep up. But was it effective? Did it actually work?
It depends who you ask. Some people said, hey, these tariffs, we need them to protect American jobs, our technology. Others said, no, this is hurting American businesses, hurting consumers, and it's not even working.
So no easy answer when it comes to tariffs. Not just a simple good or bad thing.
Exactly. Sometimes they might work, in very specific situations, but you got to use them carefully, strategically. Too many risks of things going wrong.
So it's like performing surgery, right? Only do it when you absolutely have to and make sure you got a really good surgeon.
Good analogy. And even when you do use tariffs strategically, there's still that question, who ends up paying the price?
That's what I was thinking. Even if the goal is to protect American jobs, does it really work that way? Or are we, the consumers, the ones who end up paying more?
Let me paint a picture. There's a tariff on clothes coming in from China. Stores selling those clothes, their costs go up, so what do? They can eat that cost, which hurts their profits, or they scramble to find new suppliers.
Yeah.
And that might not be possible. Or they end up with worse quality stuff.
Or, and this is probably what happens, they just raise prices and pass that cost on to us.
Bingo. And just like that, we're all paying more for our clothes, even if the whole point was to protect American textile workers.
So it's like this weird boomerang effect. You try to help one group, and you end up hurting another.
It's a tough balancing act. Got to understand all the possible outcomes. Tariffs can mess with the whole economy. Inflation, people can't buy as much stuff.
Right, okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Tariffs, they're powerful, but they're risky. But before we move on, let me play devil's advocate for a sec. Aren't there times when tariffs could actually be a good thing?
There are arguments for using tariffs strategically, but only in very specific situations. For example, maybe you want to pressure another country to stop doing something unfair in trade.
Okay.
Or maybe you're trying to help a brand new industry here at home so it doesn't get crushed by foreign competition right away.
So it's not a simple black and white issue, more like using tariffs carefully and strategically. Understand the good and the bad that can happen.
Exactly. The key is to weigh things out. What are the potential benefits? What are the risks?
Yeah.
And really grasp how the economy works, all those forces at play.
Okay, so we've navigated the choppy waters of tariffs and trade wars. But before we completely wear ourselves out, let's shift gears a bit.
Yeah.
What are some other ways to approach trade? Maybe something a little less, combative.
Yeah, let's do it.
You game.
I'm game. I think it's time to look at some approaches that are more about cooperation, about finding solutions that work for everybody.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential downsides of tariffs, but what are some other ways to approach trade that might be a little less, combative?
Yeah, one alternative that often comes up is the Free Trade Agreement,
Okay.
or FTA. These agreements, they basically aim to reduce or totally eliminate those barriers between countries who want to trade.
So instead of building walls, we're building bridges.
Exactly.
But how do these FTAs actually work in the real world?
Well, they try to create a level playing field for businesses in those countries, right?
Right.
Reduce tariffs, make customs smoother, and align all those regulations.
Okay.
This can lead to, more trade overall,
Right.
lower prices for everyone buying stuff, and just better integration economically between countries.
So it's like a win-win. Everyone benefits because there's more trade and everyone's cooperating.
Yeah, ideally.
But I've also heard, and this is a concern, that free trade agreements can cost jobs in certain industries. Is that a valid worry?
It's true. When you lower those trade barriers, some industries here at home might suddenly have to compete more with companies from other countries.
Right.
That can mean people lose jobs, and that's a serious problem. But a lot of economists, they'll say the overall benefits of free trade, like lower prices for us and more economic growth, those benefits are bigger than the costs.
So it's that balance again, trying to help free trade, but also protecting workers who might get hit by the changes. How do we find that middle ground?
It takes a multifaceted approach. You got to invest in programs to help workers learn new skills, right?
Yeah.
Support the ones who lose their jobs, and make sure that any trade deal has strong protections for labor and the environment. All those things are super important.
Right. It's not enough to just say, hey, free trade is good and leave it at that.
Right.
We got to think about the people affected by these policies,
Yeah.
make sure we're not leaving anyone behind.
And we also got to remember, trade policy doesn't exist in a bubble.
Right.
It's affected by so many things here in the U.S. and internationally.
Speaking of international stuff, what about organizations like the World Trade Organization, the WTO? They always seem to be in the middle of trade disputes. What's their role in all this?
The WTO is really important in the whole system of global trade.
Okay.
It's a place where countries can come together, work out trade deals, settle arguments, and set the rules for how trade works internationally.
So they're like the referee for the global economy, making sure everyone plays fair and nobody's getting cheated.
That's a good way to think about it. The WTO, their goal is to make trade fair and predictable, which can benefit everyone involved. Of course, they're not without their critics. Some people say they favor the richer, more developed countries over the ones that are still developing.
Sounds like there's always going to be some tension between what individual countries want and the need to work together globally when it comes to trade. Finding that perfect balance, probably easier said than done, huh?
Yeah, for sure. But at the end of the day, finding ways to cooperate, to work together, that's essential for a stable global economy, one that benefits everyone. Trade wars and protectionist policies, they rarely help in the long run. They tend to create more problems than they solve.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they keep in mind as they're trying to figure out this whole complicated world of trade and tariffs?
I think the most important thing is to be informed and engaged.
Right.
Trade policy, it impacts all of us, whether we realize it or not.
Right. It's not just something for economists to worry about.
Exactly.
It affects the prices we pay, the jobs we have, even the relationships between countries.
It's all connected.
So do your research, stay updated on what's happening with trade, and talk about these issues. Have thoughtful conversations.
Absolutely.
And maybe even get in touch with your representatives. Let them know where you stand on these things. Because trade policy is shaped by public opinion and the decisions politicians make.
That's such a crucial point. We all have a role to play in creating a fair and sustainable way to trade globally.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We explored how people really feel about tariffs, the possible fallout from trade wars, and what these free trade agreements are all about. I hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of what's shaping the global economy and the choices we have as consumers, as citizens, as people living in this interconnected world.
And don't forget, there's always more to learn. We've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
So keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep challenging your own ideas about trade and how it affects our lives.
That's fantastic advice. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of trade and tariffs. We'll see you next time.